The rhythmic, heavy splashing of massive limestone blocks plunging into the dark, cold waters of the Mediterranean echoed continuously beneath a relentless sun. Exhausted Macedonian infantrymen drove their bruised shoulders against raw timber rollers. They systematically forced the shattered remains of an abandoned mainland city into the crushing depths. In 332 BCE, a commander with no fleet stood before the greatest naval power of the era. Half a mile offshore, the island fortress of Tyre sat seemingly untouchable. It was shielded by sheer stone walls and treacherous currents that mocked the natural limits of land-based warfare. For generations, this citadel had dictated the balance of power across the sea. Yet, the besieging forces did not retreat, nor did they wait for allied ships that did not exist. Instead, when they committed to an impossible logistical paradox, they forced geography itself to bend to military ambition. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we dissect the terrifying scale and tactical obsession of the Siege of Tyre. To conquer a fortress surrounded by deep water, the Macedonian king did not merely assemble a navy. He decided to erase the sea entirely. Following the decisive victory at Issus in 333 BCE, the Persian Empire's Western military apparatus had fractured. Yet, Alexander's rear remained dangerously exposed. To march directly into the heart of Asia without securing the coastline meant leaving the formidable Persian fleet with undisputed control of the Mediterranean. They would be fully capable of striking an unprotected Greece at will. The Macedonian strategy was ruthlessly pragmatic, and they would systematically dismantle Persian naval supremacy, not by engaging in desperate sea battles, but by starving the fleet of every safe harbor along the Levantine coast. One by one, the rich Phoenician coastal cities recognized the shifting political reality. They capitulated to the approaching infantry, including the sprawling mainland settlement of Old Tyre. However, the true economic and military nucleus of Tyre did not sit on the continent. It lay half a mile offshore, completely isolated on a rocky island fortress. Fortified by sheer plunging cliffs and massive masonry walls reported to tower an astonishing 150 feet on the landward side. It was an architectural marvel explicitly designed to outlast and humiliate the greatest empires of antiquity. When Alexander sent envoys requesting entry to offer a sacrifice at the sacred temple of Heracles, the island's ruling oligarchs immediately recognized the political subjugation heavily veiled within this religious diplomacy. They firmly refused. They offered instead to let him sacrifice at the older temple on the mainland. Standing on the sun-baked shoreline, the hardened Macedonian vanguard tasted the stinging, salty sea breeze. It violently mingled with the heavy, sour stench of thousands of men in oiled leather and bronze armor. Across the churning narrow strait, the rhythmic mocking shouts of Tyrian sentries drifted over the water. It was a brazen, calculated challenge from a garrison that felt entirely invincible behind their vast natural moat. The tactical pressure weighing on the young king was absolute. Bypassing the island was strategic suicide, leaving a hostile naval superpower at his back. Yet assaulting it violated every known physical law of ancient siegecraft. The Tyrians confidently believed their island was untouchable by a terrestrial king who possessed absolutely no ships. But they severely underestimated the terrifying, obsessive will of their enemy. To reach the island, Alexander ordered an engineering feat without precedent. The abandoned ruins of mainland Old Tyre were systematically dismantled. Every house, market, and ancient temple was methodically torn down by the occupying army, reduced to raw material for a war against the sea. Simultaneously, heavily armed logging detachments marched into the dense cedar forests of Mount Lebanon. Thousands of ancient trees were felled, stripped of their branches, and hauled down to the shoreline by teams of oxen. The Macedonian strategy was terrifying in its blunt, mechanical simplicity. They would construct a solid causeway, 200 feet wide, extending directly across the deep water channel to the island's gates. The pristine coastline immediately transformed into a chaotic industrial nightmare. The air grew heavy with a permanent haze of pulverized mortar. This, mixed with the sharp, dry scent of sawdust and the pungent reek of sweat-soaked leather harnesses. The famed iron discipline of the Macedonian phalanx was entirely repurposed. Instead of the coordinated thrust of sarissas, the cadence of their advance was now dictated by the agonizing, synchronized heave of thousands of infantrymen dragging colossal limestone blocks across groaning timber rollers. It was a grinding, punishing rhythm of labor. As the mole pushed further from the shallow coastal shelf and the seabed plummeted into the treacherous depths of the strait, the ocean itself began to fight back. Relentless currents battered the loose foundations, threatening to wash away weeks of agonizing progress in a single shifting tide. To counter the sea, engineers directed the men to drive massive cedar piles deep into the mud to anchor the stone. They wove a complex skeletal framework of branches and earth to bind the heavy rubble together. Elite soldiers, accustomed to the swift, decisive violence of the open plains, found themselves reduced to exhausting, back-breaking toil. They labored waist-deep in churning, debris-filled water under a punishing sun. They were no longer simply fighting a garrison. They were attempting to pave over the Mediterranean. Yet, despite the exhaustion and the sheer logistical absurdity of the task, the artificial peninsula crept relentlessly outward. Yard by yard, it steadily narrowed the expanse of open blue water. But the Tyrians, watching from their towering, unbreached battlements, were the undisputed masters of naval warfare, and they were actively preparing a devastating, incendiary response. As the artificial peninsula finally breached the effective range of the island's artillery, the harassment intensified into a constant, lethal barrage. The Macedonian engineers found themselves pinned down by relentless bolt-thrower fire from nimble Tyrian galleys. These vessels darted into the shallows, struck their targets, and retreated far faster than the infantry could retaliate. To shield his exposed laborers, Alexander commanded the immediate construction of 2 colossal wooden siege towers. Pushed to the precarious edge of the advancing causeway, these multi-story structures were meticulously fortified with stretched raw animal hides to resist incendiary missiles. They housed heavy torsion catapults and ballistae. These were specifically designed to lay down a suppressive curtain of fire and forcefully clear the adjacent waters of enemy vessels. However, the Tyrian commanders observed this escalation and responded with a masterpiece of destructive ingenuity. They commandeered an obsolete, heavy horse transport and packed its hold to the brim with highly volatile materials. They loaded dry cedar branches, pure pitch, and raw sulfur along the vessel's prow, and they suspended heavy cauldrons overflowing with oil and flammable resins, specifically angled to spill forward upon a hard collision. Weighting the stern heavily with stone ballast to lift the prow high over the mole's submerged foundations, a skeleton crew of dedicated oarsmen drove the floating bomb straight toward the 2 Macedonian towers under the cover of a strong coastal tailwind. At the final possible moment, the crew ignited the payload and dove into the churning waves. They swam back to the safety of the fortress. The transport slammed violently into the causeway's leading edge. The sheer kinetic impact shattered the suspended cauldrons, instantly splashing boiling oil across the lower wooden struts of the siege engines. A towering wall of blistering heat erupted across the water. The sharp, acrid stench of burning sulfur and melting pitch rolled over the tightly packed Macedonian ranks, plunging the vanguard into immediate peril. Frantic, overlapping shouted commands echoed through the dense smoke as officers desperately ordered their heavy infantrymen to abandon the perimeter and fall back. Flaming debris showered down onto the stone path. The fire ignited the protective hide coverings of the towers, which quickly curled and blackened as structural supports snapped under the intense thermal stress. Tyrian galleys immediately surged forward through the haze. They launched fresh volleys of iron-tipped arrows into the disorganized laborers who were frantically trying to extinguish the rapidly spreading blaze. In a matter of minutes, months of agonizing engineering were comprehensively undone. The prized siege towers were completely reduced to smoldering ash. The structural integrity of the forward mole was severely compromised by the fire, forcing the Macedonian king to accept a harsh, undeniable tactical reality. To break the island, he had to conquer the sea. Leaving his heavy infantry to repair the scorched foundations of the Causeway, Alexander immediately departed the coastal encampment for the northern city of Sidon. The Macedonian king recognized that the vast maritime resources of the Persian Empire were geographically fragmented. He simply needed to claim them before King Darius could organize a cohesive defense. Employing a calculated mix of diplomatic coercion and the overwhelming psychological pressure of his unbroken string of terrestrial victories, Alexander systematically co-opted the regional powers. He successfully requisitioned heavily armed squadrons from Aradus, Byblos, and Sidon itself. Furthermore, 80 galleys from Cyprus, formerly the vanguard of the Persian naval apparatus, defected to his banner upon hearing of his sweeping mainland conquests. Within a matter of weeks, an astonishing armada of 223 warships was meticulously assembled under Macedonian command. The strategic paradigm flipped instantly. Tyrian sentries, entirely accustomed to gazing out over an empty, uncontested Mediterranean, awoke to a terrifying display of coordinated naval discipline. The deep, rhythmic, thunderous splashing of tens of thousands of heavy ash oars hitting the water in perfect unison began to echo across the strait. It drove a massive, sweeping wall of timber and bronze rams toward the island. Alexander did not intend to fight a chaotic engagement in open water. His tactical objective was absolute containment. He aggressively positioned his Cypriot squadrons to completely blockade the northern Sidonian harbor. Simultaneously, the newly allied Phoenician galleys sealed the southern Egyptian harbor. The Tyrian fleet, previously the apex predator of these coastal waters, suddenly found itself completely trapped behind its own defensive booms. The tactical pressure on the island's ruling council intensified exponentially as they realized the sea was no longer their sanctuary. It had been transformed into an impenetrable siege line. Vital supply routes from Carthage, heavily relied upon for emergency grain shipments and mercenary reinforcements, were permanently severed. The brazen and harassing sorties that had previously plagued the Macedonian engineers ceased entirely, replaced by a tense, heavy standoff. Yet, as the Allied Armada dropped their stone anchors and tightened the naval noose, the commanders gazing up from their swaying decks understood the grim reality of their next phase. The Tyrian fleet was neutralized, and the sea was finally conquered. But their towering, 150-foot stone walls still stood completely intact, guarding a deadly surprise for the approaching ships. The Tyrians did not merely wait behind their fortifications, they weaponized the seabed itself. Recognizing that the Macedonian armada now controlled the surface, the defenders hurled massive, irregular limestone blocks into the coastal shallows directly beneath the battlements. This created an artificial, a jagged reef specifically designed to gut the hulls of any heavy siege galleys attempting to close the final critical yards. Alexander's tactical reality was completely dictated by the harsh coastal environment. The abrupt drop-offs and treacherous lateral currents of the Mediterranean meant that advancing traditional, land-based siege towers directly off the unfinished mole was physically non-viable against the outer perimeter. The decisive blow had to be delivered from the water, but the approach was effectively barricaded by submerged stone. To dismantle this underwater fortification, the Macedonians deployed specialized shallow-draft dredging ships equipped with heavy wooden winches. Operating under a relentless canopy of enemy bolt-thrower fire, engineers directed divers to plunge into the surf. They secured thick, braided ropes around the submerged boulders, allowing the floating cranes to slowly drag the hazards out into deeper, safer currents. The Tyrians immediately escalated the tactical pressure. Armored combat swimmers slipped out from the harbor gates, initiating localized guerrilla strikes to sever the heavy hemp anchor cables of the dredging vessels. This sent the Macedonian ships drifting helplessly out of formation. Alexander's response was cold and industrialized. He stripped the vessels of vulnerable rope and replaced the entire system with heavy iron chains, entirely neutralizing the Tyrian maritime saboteurs. With the artificial reef painstakingly dragged away, the approach to the southern wall was finally clear. The Macedonian engineers unleashed an unprecedented adaptation of naval artillery. They suspended massive, bronze-headed battering rams directly upon the reinforced decks of their heaviest transport galleys. The assault transitioned into a synchronized mechanical grind. Keeping a ship perfectly stabilized in the rolling ocean currents while simultaneously driving a multi-ton ram forward required absolute discipline. The air vibrated with the rhythmic percussive impact of heavy timber striking solid stone. This was driven by the coordinated rowing of hundreds of men and the sharp, overlapping, shouted commands of the siege masters keeping the cadence. Hour after hour, the floating rams pounded against a localized weak point in the southern masonry, testing the very limits of the island's ancient engineering. The relentless, methodical pressure eventually overwhelmed the structural integrity of the fortress. A deep, but agonizing structural groan of ancient masonry giving way suddenly resonated over the water. It was followed instantly by the deafening crash of the southern wall collapsing into the waves, sending a massive plume of pulverized mortar and sea spray into the air. Through this chaotic dust-choked breach, Alexander personally ordered the heavy infantry to lower the boarding bridges. He drove his vanguard directly into the splintered gap. The impenetrable defenses had finally fallen, but the Tyrian populace refused to surrender, setting the stage for an unprecedented level of retaliation. The Macedonian hypaspists surged through the crumbling masonry. Their bronze shields drove forward in a tight, disciplined wall that immediately fractured the disorganized Tyrian defense. The pent-up psychological toll of a grueling 7-month siege was compounded by the horrifying memory of captured Macedonian soldiers being publicly executed and cast from these very battlements weeks prior, completely stripped the assaulting force of any inclination toward mercy. Street by narrow street, the phalanx advanced. Their heavy boots pounded a relentless, punishing rhythm over the shattered limestone of fallen monuments. The air was heavy with the scent of pulverized mortar and burning thatch. The defenders fought a desperate rearguard action through the dry dust. However, the supreme tactical coordination of the veteran infantry systematically isolated and dismantled the final pockets of resistance around the Temple of Agenor. The ensuing pacification was not a lapse into chaotic frenzy, but rather a cold, methodical eradication dictated from the highest command. On historical ledgers indicate that approximately 8,000 Tyrian soldiers and citizens fell in the brutal urban combat during the final hours of the assault. The physical conquest of the island was merely the prelude to Alexander's overarching strategic objective: to ensure that the remaining satrapies of the Persian Empire clearly understood the absolute cost of defiance. The Macedonian king issued a chilling, calculated directive. 2,000 military-aged men who had survived the localized street fighting were bound and systematically marched out to the shoreline. There, along the vast stretch of beach facing the newly constructed mainland bridge, they were crucified in a continuous, unbroken line of execution. The civilian demographic faced an equally devastating, permanent erasure. An estimated 30,000 citizens, comprising the remaining women, children, and nobility, were cataloged and sold directly into slavery. This effectively dispersed the foundational bloodline of an ancient Phoenician superpower across foreign markets. The wealthiest maritime hub of the Mediterranean was hollowed out, transformed instantly into a barren military garrison. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the chaotic roar of combat finally faded into an eerie, heavy silence that settled over the ruined city. This profound stillness was broken only by the rhythmic lapping of the tide against the fractured sea walls and the slow, agonizing creak of 2,000 timber crosses swaying in the evening wind. With Tyre formally extinguished, the geopolitical architecture of the Mediterranean shifted instantaneously. The entire Persian naval apparatus, deprived of its paramount stronghold, effectively dissolved. This total maritime collapse granted the Macedonian vanguard an unopposed, highly secure coastal highway directly into the wealthy heart of Egypt, permanently severing the King of Kings from the sea. Yet, the most profound historical legacy of this campaign was not ultimately recorded in the shifting political borders of ancient empires, but rather inscribed directly into the earth itself. The colossal limestone causeway, engineered at an agonizing cost in human labor, was never dismantled. Over the subsequent centuries, the relentless ocean tides continuously drove millions of tons of sediment against the artificial barricade. The gritty, abrasive sting of coastal dust swept across the abandoned works year after year, systematically burying the fractured siege engines and shattered masonry beneath rising heavy dunes. Through this slow, inevitable accumulation of earth, the fundamental geography of the Levantine coast was permanently rewritten. Alexander did not merely vanquish a sovereign garrison or breach a fortress. He commanded the ocean to recede. What had stood for millennia as an isolated, defiant island was inextricably bound to the continent, transformed forever into a sprawling peninsula that still exists in the modern era. The physical terrain itself was forced to yield. If you wish to continue exploring the decisive moments where human ambition permanently reshaped the world, please subscribe to our channel to relive these heroic chapters of history with us.